Beneath the dust of what is now considered settled history, there are places where the ground does not behave as it should. In a narrow band of desert stone, where wind strips everything down to bone-coloured rock, archaeologists occasionally find carvings that do not match any known script family, not fragments of a familiar language, not corrupted versions of something already mapped, but something structurally different enough that it resists classification entirely. Nearby, in river valleys that have carried civilizations for thousands of years, pottery appears in layers where it does not belong, as if someone briefly placed a fully formed culture into the timeline and then removed its footprints. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. These inconsistencies are often dismissed individually. A misdated shard here, a misinterpreted symbol there, a trade object that travelled further than expected. But when viewed together across continents, they begin to suggest something uncomfortable for the standard narrative of ancient history. Not a single anomaly, but a pattern of absence. Entire regions where historical records should overlap, yet do not. Cultural developments that appear suddenly, fully formed, as if they were transplanted rather than evolved. In the conventional telling of early human civilization, progress is uneven but traceable. Agriculture develops in recognizable centers, writing systems emerge in connected stages, and technological advancement follows lines that can be mapped and compared. Yet in several parts of the world, there are breaks in this logic. Sudden leaps that appear without a clear chain of development, techniques in metallurgy that show up too early, architectural methods that seem to anticipate later engineering principles by centuries or even millennia. The most unsettling aspect is not what is present in the record, but what is missing. There are references in multiple unrelated ancient traditions to a powerful land, often described in vague but consistent terms. A civilization associated with great wealth, structured governance, and unusual knowledge of materials and construction. These references do not agree on its location or name, but they overlap in tone and detail in ways that are difficult to ignore. In some versions, it is described as a first-order civilization, older than the kingdoms that later defined recorded history. In others, it is portrayed as a forgotten source from which later societies inherited fragments of knowledge. Modern archaeology does not officially recognise such a unified entity. There is no agreed-upon map, no capital city, no definitive timeline, yet the absence of evidence is itself part of the puzzle. Some scholars still debate whether the silence in the archaeological record is meaningful or simply the result of erosion, incomplete excavation, and the fragility of early materials. Others argue that the pattern is too structured to be accidental, that it behaves like a deliberately removed layer of history. In certain excavation sites, layers of soil appear disturbed in ways that are difficult to explain through natural processes alone. Not destruction from catastrophe, but selective removal, objects of high cultural value missing while mundane artifacts remain. It is as if someone, at some distant point in the past, chose what should be remembered and what should be forgotten. The idea sounds speculative, yet similar patterns appear across multiple regions separated by oceans and mountain ranges. What makes this even more intriguing is the way later civilizations behave toward these traces. In some ancient texts, there are references to earlier builders or those who came before the kings, always spoken about indirectly, never named with clarity. These references are often treated as mythological embellishments, but their consistency suggests they may preserve distorted memory rather than pure invention. The hidden superpower at the centre of this narrative is not defined by a single discovery or artifact. It is defined by absence, by the space between confirmed historical milestones, where something significant seems to have existed, but left no stable footprint. A civilization advanced enough to influence surrounding regions, yet elusive enough to vanish from collective record with unusual completeness. There are also environmental clues that complicate the picture. Sediment layers in certain ancient coastal regions suggest sudden shifts in human activity, bursts of construction, and population density followed by abrupt decline. Not always matching known climate events, not always aligning with volcanic or tectonic disruptions. These patterns raise questions about whether something systemic, rather than purely environmental, influenced the rise and disappearance of large organised societies in specific eras. It is important to remain cautious here. No single piece of evidence confirms the existence of a deliberately erased superpower. Each fragment can be explained in isolation. Misinterpretation, incomplete excavation, natural decay, and the limitations of surviving records all provide reasonable alternatives. But when these fragments are assembled side by side, they begin to form an outline that is difficult to fully dismiss. A civilization, or perhaps a network of connected cultures, that reached a level of complexity significant enough to influence others, one that may have shaped early technological and cultural foundations more deeply than currently acknowledged, and one that, for reasons still unclear, does not appear in the way history usually preserves such influence. The question that emerges is not simply whether this superpower existed, but how something so influential could become so difficult to see in the archaeological and written record. Civilizations typically leave echoes that persist, even after collapsed language traces, architectural influence, genetic continuity, cultural memory. Yet here, the echoes are faint, inconsistent, and scattered in ways that resist straightforward reconstruction. And so the investigation begins not with certainty, but with gaps, with silence in places where continuity should exist, with fragments that feel less like ruins of a known world and more like remnants of something that was intentionally stripped of coherence. The deeper this absence is examined, the more it begins to feel less like missing history and more like redirected history, not erased completely, but reshaped into something safer, simpler, and easier to transmit across generations. Whether that shaping was deliberate or accidental remains one of the central tensions in the entire mystery. What remains now is to follow those fragments outward from the silence, into the landscapes that may still carry faint imprints of what once stood there, and into the earliest conditions that allowed such a civilization, if it truly existed, take form in the first place. Word count 1186, awaiting continue. Quiche Ban Roll, you are my single-speaker, long-form YouTube scriptwriter for mystery history. Ancient civilizations, prehistory, archaeology, vanished cultures, unexplained historical events, deep-time disasters, and strange human past stories. Core goal: write a long-form, highly engaging, continuous narrative script for videos in the style of titles such as Entire civilizations vanished, ancient worlds collapsed, strange species disappeared, places transformed beyond recognition, mysteries history still cannot fully explain, prehistoric life, ancient humans, lost landscapes, forgotten empires, unexplained texts, vanished seas, green deserts, giant waves, hidden islands, extinct species, ancient catastrophes. The script must feel immersive, curiosity-driven, dramatic but grounded, easy to listen to for a long time, and suitable for a 2 to 3 hour video. Global specs topic: the terrifying winter that nearly ended humanity roll. You are my single-speaker long-form YouTube scriptwriter for mystery history. Ancient civilizations, prehistory, archaeology, vanished cultures, unexplained historical events, deep-time disasters, and strange human past stories. Core goal: write a long-form, highly engaging, continuous narrative script for videos in the style of titles such as Entire civilizations vanished, ancient worlds collapsed, strange species disappeared, places transformed beyond recognition, mysteries history still cannot fully explain, prehistoric life, ancient humans, lost landscapes, forgotten empires, unexplained texts, vanished seas, green deserts, giant waves, hidden islands, extinct species, ancient catastrophes. The script must feel immersive, curiosity-driven, dramatic but grounded, easy to listen to for a long time, and suitable for a 2 to 3 hour video. Global specs topic: the ancient superpower history. Tried to erase target runtime around 2 to 3 hours. Target length 20,000 to 21,000 words total. Write as one continuous script with seamless flow. Do not write in short fragmented paragraphs. Do not make the narration feel chopped into isolated chapters. The script must read like one long unfolding story. Delivery structure: use a hidden 15-part internal structure for planning and pacing. But the narration itself must remain smooth and continuous. Each section should be approximately 1,300 to 1,400 words. Total equals 15 sections. After section 15, add a final 350 to 500 word slow wind down. 2-step workflow. Step 1, 15 bullet outline. Reply first with exactly 15 bullets. Each bullet must represent one future section. Each bullet must contain a mini title of no more than 8 words, one sentence explaining the exact focus of that section. The 15 bullets must build logically from beginning to end, like a documentary arc context to rise or formation, to turning point to mystery/problem, to evidence to competing explanations to consequences to legacy. Stop after the outline. Wait for my continue. Step 2, section writing. For each continue, write only the next section. Follow the exact promise of the matching outline bullet. Do not drift ahead into later sections. Do not repeat earlier explanations unnecessarily. Do not restart the topic at the start of each section. Start each response with section number. Then write the section as continuous narration only. End each section with word count awaiting continue. After section 15, write the final wind down and end with end of script. Opening style for section 1. Start with a strong immersive hook. Open immediately inside the mystery landscape. Collapse, discovery, extinction, lost world, or ancient turning point connected to the topic. The opening should feel cinematic, intriguing, and story-led, not academic and not slow. Do not waste time with generic introduction lines. Do not use in tonight's video style phrasing unless requested. Do not use list-like preview intros. You may include an actual YouTube CTA once near the beginning, in a smooth way that matches the tone before we go deeper. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Narrative style. Rules. Write in clear, natural, modern English. Single narrator only. Default perspective. Third-person narrative. Use present tense whenever possible for immediacy. Tone immersive documentary narrator with calm authority. Mystery, gravity, and occasional dry understatement. Do not make it sound childish, overly theatrical, or clickbait heavy. Do not use dialogue. Do not use quotations unless absolutely necessary for a historical source, and even then keep them very short. Do not use slang that breaks the historical atmosphere. Do not use exaggerated hype language. Do not use rhetorical questions too often. Do not write like a textbook. Content rules. Each section should include a balanced mix of established historical or scientific understanding, vivid environmental and human detail, at least one lesser known or surprising detail, at least one phrase acknowledging uncertainty, such as scholars still debate, the evidence remains incomplete, no single explanation fully accounts for this, what survives in the record suggests. For every major claim, stay aligned with mainstream historical, archaeological, geological, anthropological, or scientific understanding. When evidence is uncertain, clearly separate what is known from what is inferred, avoid presenting fringe theories as fact, mention fringe or popular theories only briefly, and label them as disputed or unsupported where necessary suitable topic types. The script should work well for topics such as vanished civilizations, lost cities, ancient collapses, prehistoric climate shifts, extinct human relatives, strange islands and isolated populations, forgotten books and undeciphered writing, ancient engineering mysteries, catastrophic floods, droughts, eruptions, and impacts, deserts that were once green, seas that disappeared, migrations, bottlenecks, disappearances, and survival stories, mystery history with strong documentary storytelling, continuity rules. The script must feel cumulative. Each section should connect naturally to the previous one. Use subtle callbacks to earlier details when useful. Do not recap too often. Do not announce transitions mechanically. Avoid phrases like, in this section, in the next chapter, as mentioned above. Now let us move on. The next thing to discuss. Instead, glide into the next idea naturally. Formatting rules. No bullet points in the script itself. No tables. No citations. No URLs. No academic footnotes. No emojis. No screenplay formatting. No sound effect cues. No stage directions. No repeated title restatements. Paragraphs should be medium to long, built for uninterrupted listening. Pacing rules. Keep curiosity active throughout the full runtime. Every section should add at least one new layer. A deeper cause, a human consequence, a strange clue, a scientific insight, a hidden contradiction, a surviving trace in the present. The pacing must be strong enough to hold a 2 to 3 hour audience, but smooth enough for long-form listening. Avoid both extremes, too dry and repetitive, too dramatic and sensational. Wind down. At the very end, write a 350 to 500 word closing wind down, slow the rhythm, use softer sentence flow, widen the lens from the specific topic to time, memory, landscape. Survival, disappearance, or the fragility of civilizations, end calmly with a lingering final image. Important final rule. Principal limit line breaks and write continuously. The script must feel like one long uninterrupted documentary narration, not a stack of separate essays. Begin now with step 1, 15 bullet outline only. Roll you are my single speaker long-form YouTube scriptwriter for mystery history, ancient civilizations, prehistory, archaeology, vanished cultures, unexplained historical events, deep time disasters, and strange human past stories. Core goal. Write a long-form, highly engaging, continuous narrative script for videos in the style of titles such as Entire Civilizations Vanished, Ancient Worlds Collapsed, Strange Species Disappeared, Places Transformed Beyond Recognition, Mysteries History Still Cannot Fully Explain, Prehistoric Life, Ancient Humans, Lost Landscapes, Forgotten Empires, Unexplained Texts, Vanished Seas, Green Deserts, Giant Waves, Hidden Islands, Extinct Species, Ancient Catastrophes. The script must feel immersive, curiosity-driven, dramatic but grounded, easy to listen to for a long time, and suitable for a 2 to 3 hour video. Global Specs topic. The ancient superpower history. Try to erase target runtime around 2 to 3 hours. Target length 15,000 to 16,000 words total. Write as one continuous script with seamless flow. Do not write in short, fragmented paragraphs. Do not make the narration feel chopped into isolated chapters. The script must read like one long unfolding story. Delivery structure. Use a hidden 15-part internal structure for planning and pacing. But the narration itself must remain smooth and continuous. Each section should be approximately 1,100 to 1,200 words. Total equals 15 sections. After section 15, add a final 350 to 500 words slow wind down. 2-step workflow. Step 1. 15 bullet outline. Reply first with exactly 15 bullets. Each bullet must represent one future section. Each bullet must contain a mini title of no more than 8 words, one sentence explaining the exact focus of that section. The 15 bullets must build logically from beginning to end, like a documentary arc context to rise or formation, to turning point to mystery/problem to evidence to competing explanations to consequences to legacy. Stop after the outline. Wait for my continue. Step 2. Section writing. For each continue, write only the next section. Follow the exact promise of the matching outline bullet. Do not drift ahead into later sections. Do not repeat earlier explanations unnecessarily. Do not restart the topic at the start of each section. Start each response with section number, then write the section as continuous narration only. End each section with word count roar. Awaiting continue. After section 15, write the final wind down and end with the end of script. Opening style for section 1. Start with a strong immersive hook. Open immediately inside the mystery, landscape, collapse, discovery, extinction, lost world, or ancient turning point connected to the topic. The opening should feel cinematic, intriguing, and story-led, not academic and not slow. Do not waste time with generic introduction lines. Do not use in tonight's video-style phrasing unless requested. Do not use list-like preview intros. You may include a natural YouTube CTA once near the beginning, in a smooth way that matches the tone before we go deeper. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, narrative style rules, write in clear, natural modern English, single narrator only, default perspective, third-person narrative, use present tense whenever possible for immediacy, tone immersive documentary narrator with calm authority, mystery, gravity, an occasional dry understatement. Do not make it sound childish, overly theatrical, or clickbait heavy. Do not use dialogue. Do not use quotations unless absolutely necessary for a historical source, and even then keep them very short. Do not use slang that breaks the historical atmosphere. Do not use exaggerated hype language. Do not use rhetorical questions too often. Do not write like a textbook. Content rules. Each section should include a balanced mix of established historical or scientific understanding, vivid environmental and human detail, at least one lesser-known or surprising detail, at least one phrase acknowledging uncertainty, such as scholars still debate. The evidence remains incomplete. No single explanation fully accounts for this. What survives in the record suggests. For every major claim, stay aligned with mainstream historical, archaeological, geological, anthropological, or scientific understanding when evidence is uncertain. Clearly separate what is known from what is inferred. Avoid presenting fringe theories as fact. Mention fringe or popular theories only briefly, and label them as disputed or unsupported when necessary suitable topic types. The script should work well for topics such as vanished civilizations, lost cities, ancient collapses, prehistoric climate shifts, extinct human relatives, strange islands and isolated populations, forgotten books and undeciphered writing, ancient engineering mysteries, catastrophic floods, droughts, eruptions, and impacts, deserts that were once green, seas that disappeared, migrations, bottlenecks, disappearances, and survival stories, mystery history with strong documentary storytelling, continuity rules. The script must feel cumulative. Each section should connect naturally to the previous one. Use subtle callbacks to earlier details when useful. Do not recap too often. Do not announce transitions mechanically. Avoid phrases like, in this section, in the next chapter, as mentioned above. Now let us move on. The next thing to discuss instead. Glide into the next idea naturally. Formatting rules. No bullet points in the script itself. No tables, no citations, no URLs, no academic footnotes, no emojis, no screenplay formatting, no sound effect cues, no stage directions, no repeated title restatements. Paragraphs should be medium to long, built for uninterrupted listening. Pacing rules. Keep curiosity active throughout the full runtime. Every section should add at least one new layer. A deeper cause, a human consequence, a strange clue, a scientific insight, a hidden contradiction, a surviving trace in the present. The pacing must be strong enough to hold a 2 to 3 hour audience, but smooth enough for long-form listening. Avoid both extremes, too dry and repetitive, too dramatic and sensational. Wind down at the very end, write a 350 to 500 word closing wind down, slow the rhythm, use softer sentence flow, widen the lens from the specific topic to time, memory, landscape. Survival, disappearance, or the fragility of civilizations, end calmly, with a lingering final image. Important final rule. Principal limit line breaks and write continuously. The script must feel like one long uninterrupted documentary narration, not a stack of separate essays. Begin now with step 1, the 15-bullet outline only. Target runtime around 2 to 3 hours. Target length 20,000 to 21,000 words total. Write as one continuous script with seamless flow. Do not write in short fragmented paragraphs. Do not make the narration feel chopped into isolated chapters. The script must read like one long unfolding story. Delivery structure. Use a hidden 15-part internal structure for planning and pacing, but the narration itself must remain smooth and continuous. Each section should be approximately 1,100 to 1,200 words. Total equals 15 sections. After section 15, add a final 350 to 500 word slow wind down. 2-step workflow. Step 1. 15-bullet outline. Reply first with exactly 15 bullets. Each bullet must represent one future section. Each bullet must contain a mini title of no more than 8 words, one sentence explaining the exact focus of that section. The 15 bullets must build logically from beginning to end, like a documentary arc context to rise or formation, to turning point to mystery/problem to evidence to competing explanations to consequences to legacy. Stop after the outline. Wait for my continue. Step 2. Section writing. For each continue, write only the next section. Follow the exact promise of the matching outline bullet. Do not drift ahead into later sections. Do not repeat earlier explanations unnecessarily. Do not restart the topic at the start of each section. Start each response with section number, then write the section as continuous narration only. End each section with word count jas, awaiting continue after section 15. Write the final wind down and end with end of script. Opening style for section 1. Start with a strong immersive hook. Open immediately inside the mystery, landscape, collapse, discovery, extinction, lost world, or ancient turning point connected to the topic. The opening should feel cinematic, intriguing, and story-led, not academic and not slow. Do not waste time with generic introduction lines. Do not use tonight's video-style phrasing unless requested. Do not use list-like preview intros. You may include a natural YouTube CTA once near the beginning, in a smooth way that matches the tone. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Narrative style rules. Writing clear, natural, modern English. Single narrator only. Default perspective, third-person narrative. Use present tense whenever possible for immediacy. Tone. Immersive documentary narrator with calm authority, mystery, gravity, and occasional dry understatement. Do not make it sound childish, overly theatrical, or clickbait heavy. Do not use dialogue. Do not use quotations unless absolutely necessary for a historical source, and even then keep them very short. Do not use slang that breaks the historical atmosphere. Do not use exaggerated hype language. Do not use rhetorical questions too often. Do not write like a textbook. Content rules. Each section should include a balanced mix of established historical or scientific understanding, vivid environmental and human detail, at least one lesser-known or surprising detail, at least one phrase acknowledging uncertainty. Such as scholars still debate, the evidence remains incomplete. No single explanation fully accounts for this. What survives in the record suggests. For every major claim, stay aligned with mainstream historical, archaeological, geological, anthropological, or scientific understanding. When evidence is uncertain, clearly separate what is known from what is inferred. Avoid presenting fringe theories as fact. Mention fringe or popular theories only briefly, and label them as disputed or unsupported where necessary suitable topic types. The script should work well for topics such as vanished civilizations, lost cities, ancient collapses, prehistoric climate shifts, extinct human relatives, strange islands and isolated populations, forgotten books and undeciphered writing, ancient engineering mysteries, catastrophic floods, droughts, eruptions, and impacts, deserts that were once green, seas that disappeared, migrations, bottlenecks, disappearances, and survival stories, mystery history with strong documentary storytelling continuity rules. The script must feel cumulative. Each section should connect naturally to the previous one. Use subtle callbacks to earlier details when useful. Do not recap too often. Do not announce transitions mechanically. Avoid phrases like, in this section, in the next chapter, as mentioned above. Now let us move on. The next thing to discuss. Instead, glide into the next idea naturally. Formatting rules. No bullet points in the script itself. No tables. No citations. No URLs. No academic footnotes. No emojis. No screenplay formatting. No sound effect cues. No stage directions. No repeated title restatements. Paragraphs should be medium to long, built for uninterrupted listening. Pacing rules. Keep curiosity active throughout the full runtime. Every section should add at least one new layer. A deeper cause, a human consequence, a strange clue, a scientific insight, a hidden contradiction, a surviving trace in the present. The pacing must be strong enough to hold a 2 to 3 hour audience, but smooth enough for long-form listening. Avoid both extremes, too dry and repetitive, too dramatic and sensational. Wind down at the very end, write a 350 to 500 word closing wind down, slow the rhythm, use softer sentence flow, widen the lens from the specific topic to time, memory, landscape. Survival, disappearance, or the fragility of civilizations end calmly with a lingering final image. Important final rule. Principal limit line breaks and write continuously. The script must feel like one long, uninterrupted documentary narration, not a stack of separate essays. Begin now with step 1, the 15-bullet outline only. Silent evidence beneath ancient layers introduces archaeological gaps and suppressed inconsistencies that suggest a lost dominant civilization. A world before recorded empires describes the environmental and cultural conditions preceding known early states and where anomalies begin to appear. First echoes and fragmented myths. Examines shared myths across distant cultures that hint at a powerful forgotten predecessor civilization. Unearthed trade beyond known networks reveals unexpected artifacts and materials indicating long-distance exchange beyond accepted ancient trade routes. The rise of an unseen superpower explores how this civilization may have rapidly expanded influence through innovation and strategic control. Technologies that rewrite timelines focuses on advanced engineering and knowledge appearing earlier than conventional history allows. Rivals. across connected civilizations shows how neighbouring powers responded to an expanding, destabilising force in the ancient world. Early attempts at historical control investigate signs of narrative suppression, altered records, and selective memory in surviving texts. A war that vanished from records reconstructs evidence of large-scale conflict that seems deliberately minimised or erased. Collapse, hidden behind silence, examines internal decline driven by environmental stress, politics, and resource imbalance. The final event of disappearance describes a sudden turning point that ended the civilization's visible presence in history. Systematic erasure by successors explores how later empires may have rewritten history to remove traces of the superpower. Artifacts that should not exist highlights physical remnants that contradict official historical timelines and accepted narratives. Competing theories of modern scholars presents mainstream and fringe interpretations attempting to explain the missing civilization. The legacy embedded in civilization reveals subtle cultural, linguistic, and technological traces that persist into the modern world. TEP Section 1. Deep beneath layers of soil that have been turned and retuned by thousands of years of farming, flooding, and rebuilding, something unusual begins to appear in scattered excavation sites. Not a single object that would immediately rewrite history, but a pattern of absences and misalignments that refuses to settle into any familiar framework. A settlement layer here that seems too advanced for its assigned period. A cluster of artifacts there that do not match the cultural sequence expected in that region, and in between them, long stretches of silence where continuity should exist. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, archaeology usually builds its understanding through accumulation. Pottery styles evolve gradually, tools refine over generations, and architectural methods follow traceable lines of development. Yet in several regions of the ancient world, those lines appear disrupted. Entire stages seem to be missing, as if someone removed the intermediate steps between early experimentation and mature civilization. What remains looks sudden, almost artificially complete. In river valleys where early societies are well documented, researchers sometimes encounter deeper strata that do not fit the expected progression. These layers do not always indicate a different culture in the conventional sense, but rather a level of complexity that should not yet exist according to established timelines. Advanced metallurgy in contexts where only primitive techniques should appear. Symbol systems that resemble writing but do not align with any known script family. Infrastructure fragments suggesting coordinated planning on a scale larger than the surrounding evidence supports. What makes these anomalies more intriguing is their distribution. They are not confined to one region or one climate zone. Similar inconsistencies appear in parts of Eurasia, the Near East, and even distant regions where early civilizations developed independently, while each site can be explained individually as an outlier or misinterpretation. The repetition of the pattern raises questions about whether something larger once connected these scattered points. Some researchers describe this as a shadow layer in human history, not conspiracy in the literal sense, but a conceptual gap where evidence suggests complexity existed before it becomes visible in the archaeological record. The idea is controversial, and many scholars caution that such interpretations risk overreading incomplete data. Natural processes, after all, are destructive. Floods erase settlements, earthquakes bury cities, organic materials decay. Entire chapters of history can disappear without requiring any deliberate intervention. Yet even within this caution, there are cases that resist simple explanation. In certain excavation zones, the transition from minimal settlement to organised urban structure is abrupt. No gradual accumulation of village networks, no intermediate stages of experimentation. Instead, fully formed administrative systems appear with surprising speed, calendrical systems, standardised weights, coordinated construction techniques. It is not the presence of complexity that is unusual, but its timing. Environmental studies offer partial insight into these shifts. Climate fluctuations during the Holocene created cycles of expansion and retreat for early human populations. River systems changed course. Fertile zones expanded and contracted. In some regions, sudden environmental stability may have accelerated cultural development, compressing what might otherwise have been a long evolutionary process into a shorter, visible span. But even this explanation does not fully account for the consistency of the pattern across unrelated regions. What deepens the mystery further are fragments of myth and oral tradition preserved in later civilizations. Many early societies, separated by vast geography and time, contain stories of a prior age and earlier order of human existence that preceded the known foundations of their world. These accounts rarely describe it in concrete terms. Instead, they refer to an age of first knowledge, earlier rulers, or civilizations that existed before the present cycle of humanity. While such stories are often interpreted as symbolic or religious in nature, their recurrence across cultures has drawn the attention of comparative historians. In Mesopotamian texts, there are references to antediluvian knowledge passed down from distant figures. In parts of South Asia, traditions speak of previous ages where human capability and organisation reached heights later lost. In the Americas, oral histories in some indigenous cultures preserve memories of earlier peoples who inhabited the land before known tribal histories. Each tradition stands independently, yet together they form a faint echo of something older than the written record. No single interpretation of these traditions is universally accepted. Mainstream scholarship generally treats them as mythological frameworks used to explain natural cycles, environmental disasters, or cultural memory of older settlements. However, a smaller group of researchers argues that myths sometimes preserve distorted memory of real historical processes, especially when written records are absent or deliberately altered. The challenge lies in distinguishing symbolic narrative from historical residue. Ancient societies did not separate myth, history, and cosmology in the way modern analysis does. A story could be both cultural explanation and memory preservation at the same time. This ambiguity leaves room for multiple interpretations, none of which fully resolve the inconsistencies found in the archaeological record. As excavations expand and dating techniques become more precise, the gaps do not disappear. In some cases, they become sharper. Radiocarbon dating reveals overlaps that should not occur. Material culture appears in unexpected strata. Genetic studies show population continuity where cultural discontinuity is observed, suggesting that people remained in place even as their material culture shifted abruptly. This combination of stability and disruption is one of the most puzzling aspects of early human development. It suggests that history may not be a smooth line of progression, but a layered structure shaped by episodes of acceleration, collapse, and possible reinvention. Whether these episodes were driven entirely by environmental forces or influenced by lost networks of human organisation remains an open question. What emerges from all these fragments is not a clear picture of a forgotten empire, but something more unsettling. A suggestion that human civilization may have experienced phases of development that were not preserved evenly in the record, phases that left traces too inconsistent to be fully integrated into the accepted timeline, yet too persistent to be dismissed entirely. And as these traces accumulate, they begin to form the outline of a possibility that archaeology has not yet fully reconciled. The possibility that beneath the familiar sequence of known civilizations lies another layer, one that once connected distant regions and influenced early development, and then disappeared in such a way that only fragments survived. The task now is not to define that lost structure too quickly, but to follow its echoes outward into trade patterns that should not exist, into artifacts that appear far from their origin, and into the earliest signs that something far more interconnected may have once shaped the ancient world. In the dry river corridors where early human settlements first began to cluster into something resembling structured society, the ground holds a quiet contradiction. On the surface, there are familiar signs of gradual development, small habitations expanding into villages, then into towns, then into the first recognisable administrative centres. But just beneath that surface continuity, there are moments where the pattern tightens unnaturally, as if an unseen hand briefly accelerated the process and then withdrew. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. What archaeologists expect in these regions is slow layering, a long transition from simple agricultural communities to organised states, marked by incremental improvements in tools, storage, irrigation, and governance. Yet in several river valleys that later became cradles of civilization, the earliest fully formed settlements appear with a degree of coordination that does not match the surrounding developmental stages. Not crude prototypes of cities, but functioning systems. Streets with planned layouts, standardized storage practices, and administrative control that suggests experience rather than experimentation. This does not mean civilization appeared instantly. The evidence still shows gradual human presence, seasonal camps, and small farming groups stretching back thousands of years. But between those early traces and the emergence of structured societies, something appears to compress time. The usual intermediate stages are either extremely short-lived or missing altogether. It is as if the learning curve was already partially completed before it became visible in the archaeological record. One of the most intriguing aspects of this compression is the consistency of its outcome. Across different regions, early urban centres share structural similarities that are difficult to explain through isolated invention alone. Systems of measurement appear in different cultures with unexpected alignment. Architectural proportions sometimes reflect shared mathematical principles before any known contact between those societies is established. Even writing systems, when they emerge, show structural echoes that suggest parallel development shaped by something more than coincidence. This raises a difficult question that scholars still debate whether early human societies developed independently in tightly similar ways due to shared environmental pressures, or whether there was once a broad network of knowledge exchange that has since been erased or fragmented beyond recognition. The mainstream explanation leans toward convergent development, where similar problems produce similar solutions: water management, food storage, and population coordination naturally lead to comparable innovations, but this does not fully account for the timing and distribution of certain advanced features. In some excavation sites, for example, the earliest layers of urbanization include engineering decisions that imply long-term planning, drainage systems integrated into city layouts from the beginning, rather than added later, defensive structures positioned with awareness of terrain optimization, storage facilities scaled for populations that had not yet fully materialized in the archaeological sequence. These details suggest not only innovation, but foresight shaped by experience. Environmental context does provide part of the explanation. During the early Holocene, shifting climate patterns created zones of intense ecological opportunity. River systems became more stable in certain periods, allowing rapid population growth and settlement consolidation. In such conditions, cultural acceleration is expected. Groups that had already developed basic organizational strategies could scale them quickly when conditions became favorable. Still, acceleration is not the same as absence of development. and here the record feels uneven in a way that continues to challenge simple models. Adding to this complexity are the materials themselves. In several early urban layers, researchers have identified trade goods that originate from regions far beyond what would normally be considered reachable at that stage of development. Obsidian, shells, rare metals, and carved objects appear in contexts suggesting long-distance exchange networks already in place at a very early date. These networks imply not just mobility, but coordination across vast distances, something that typically develops after stable urban systems are established, not before. Some of these anomalies can be explained through indirect trade chains, where goods pass through multiple intermediary groups before reaching their final destination. Over time, even simple exchange systems can extend their reach across continents without requiring centralized control. However, the consistency and sophistication of certain early exchanges make it difficult to dismiss all cases as purely indirect diffusion. There is also the matter of cultural synchronization. In regions that were once considered isolated, similar symbolic motifs appear in early decorative systems. Spiral patterns, geometric grids, and stylized depictions of natural forces emerge in different parts of the ancient world with striking resemblance. While symbolism can arise independently from shared human cognition, the repetition of specific structural designs across unconnected cultures continues to invite careful scrutiny. Oral traditions preserved in later civilizations add another layer of ambiguity. Many early societies describe a period before their recorded history in which knowledge was already present in structured form, not fully explained, not fully originated within their own lineage, but inherited or rediscovered from earlier sources. These traditions are often symbolic, and scholars rightly caution against reading them as literal historical accounts. Yet their persistence across unrelated cultures suggests that they may preserve a distant memory of something real, even if heavily transformed over time. Genetic and anthropological data add yet another dimension. Human populations in these regions often show long-term continuity, meaning that the same groups persisted through these early transitions. There is no evidence of sudden replacement that would explain the emergence of advanced systems through external introduction of entirely new populations. Instead, it appears that local groups themselves underwent rapid cultural transformation. This combination of population stability, cultural acceleration, and uneven technological emergence creates a paradox that remains unresolved. It suggests that whatever drove the rise of early complex societies did not come from outside replacement, but from internal dynamics that are still not fully understood. Environmental stability, social cooperation, and accumulated knowledge all play roles, but the unevenness of the record suggests additional factors may be missing from the current model. Some researchers propose that knowledge transfer mechanisms in early societies may have been more fragile than previously thought. Oral systems, symbolic encoding, and early proto-writing could have carried sophisticated information that was later lost or fragmented before full writing systems stabilized. In this view, what appears as sudden emergence is actually the final visible stage of a longer, partially invisible process. Others argue that catastrophic interruptions, flooding events, regional climate shifts, or localized collapses may have repeatedly reset cultural development, erasing intermediate stages while allowing later societies to rebuild rapidly using inherited fragments of knowledge. This would create the illusion of sudden advancement, when in fact it is layered reconstruction over repeated loss. Neither explanation fully resolves the pattern. Both account for parts of the evidence, yet both leave gaps where the anomalies persist. And it is precisely in those gaps that the idea of a lost, more connected ancient world begins to take shape, not as a fully formed empire, but as a possibility that early human civilization may have been more interconnected and more vulnerable to fragmentation than the surviving record suggests. As the evidence continues to accumulate, the focus shifts away from individual sites and toward the relationships between them. The trade routes that should not yet exist, the technologies that appear too early, the cultural motifs that repeat across distance. Each fragment alone is explainable, but together they begin to hint at a deeper structure, one that once linked scattered early societies into something more cohesive than the modern map of ancient history allows. And it is within that emerging pattern that the next layer of the mystery begins to form, where evidence of connection becomes more explicit, and where the possibility of a hidden superpower begins to move from speculation towards something more difficult to ignore. In a limestone cavern system that once sat far from any major ancient settlement, archaeologists uncover a set of trade materials that should not exist together in the same time layer. Shells from distant coastlines rest beside obsidian from volcanic highlands. Copper artifacts appear alongside stone tools that belong to a far earlier technological stage. Nothing about the deposit suggests a simple village cache or a local exchange network. Instead, it resembles a point of convergence. As if multiple distant worlds briefly intersected here under conditions that are no longer fully understood. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Trade in early human history is usually slow, indirect, and geographically constrained. Goods move outward in steps, passing through a chain of communities over generations. The idea of long-distance exchange is not unusual, but it is typically gradual in its expansion. Yet in several early archaeological contexts, the distribution of material suggests something more coordinated. Objects travel farther than expected, and sometimes in patterns that imply repeated routes rather than accidental diffusion. One of the most striking examples comes from obsidian sourcing studies. By analysing chemical signatures, researchers can trace volcanic glass artifacts back to specific geological origins. In several ancient settlements, obsidian has been found originating hundreds of kilometers away, sometimes across terrain that would have been extremely difficult to traverse consistently without established pathways. This alone does not imply a centralized system. But the regularity of such findings across multiple regions raises questions about how early exchange networks formed so quickly and so widely. What deepens the mystery is not just distance, but distribution logic. In some cases, high-quality materials appear disproportionately concentrated in certain sites that were not necessarily the largest or most politically dominant in their region. These nodes seem to function as collection or redistribution points, suggesting a level of organization beyond simple barter between neighboring groups. It is not empire in the formal sense, but neither is it purely local interaction. At the same time, archaeological layers reveal sudden bursts of cultural uniformity across wide areas. Decorative motifs, tool shapes, and construction techniques sometimes align across regions that show no clear evidence of direct contact in other respects. This kind of synchronization is difficult to interpret. It could reflect shared environmental pressures leading to similar solutions, or it could suggest that information once flowed more freely between communities than the surviving record indicates. Some researchers propose that early human populations may have been far more mobile than traditionally assumed. Seasonal migration patterns, river navigation, and coastal travel could have enabled the exchange of ideas and goods over large distances without requiring permanent infrastructure. In this view, what appears as coordinated systems may actually be the emergent result of repeated interactions over time. However, even this explanation struggles to account for the consistency of certain material distributions. There are also sites where imported materials appear alongside advanced local production in ways that suggest selective acquisition. High-status objects made from rare materials are often found in administrative or ceremonial contexts, indicating that these goods were not simply traded commodities but part of a broader system of social value. This implies not only movement of goods, but movement of meaning, shared understandings of status, symbolism, an authority that extended beyond local cultures. In some of the earliest urban centres, storage facilities reveal standardized measurement systems that appear suddenly and fully formed. Units of weight and volume are consistent within regions that otherwise show diverse cultural backgrounds. The emergence of such standardization is typically associated with administrative complexity and centralized coordination. Yet the origins of these systems are often poorly documented, appearing in the record without a clear developmental trail. This is where the idea of a hidden superpower begins to take shape, not as a single empire with borders and capitals, but as a possible network of influence that shaped early systems of exchange, measurement, and cultural alignment. If such a network existed, it would not necessarily leave behind monumental architecture or clear political inscriptions. Instead, it would manifest through patterns of similarity, distribution, and synchronization that are difficult to explain through isolated development alone. Still, caution is necessary. Similarity does not automatically imply coordination. Human societies, even when isolated, often develop comparable solutions to similar environmental and social challenges. The invention of agriculture, for example, emerged independently in multiple regions. Writing systems also arose separately in different parts of the world. Convergent evolution is a powerful explanatory framework, and it remains the dominant interpretation in mainstream scholarship. However, convergence alone does not always account for timing. In several regions, complex systems appear within relatively narrow time windows, sometimes separated by great distance. This temporal clustering suggests that while development may have been independent, it may also have been influenced by broader environmental or cognitive thresholds that multiple societies crossed at similar times. Climate stability, population density, and resource abundance could all contribute to synchronized innovation. Another factor that complicates interpretation is the uneven survival of evidence. Organic materials decay, settlements are buried or destroyed, rivers change course. What survives is a biased sample of what once existed. It is entirely possible that intermediate stages of exchange networks existed, but have not been preserved in the archaeological record. A fragile system of long-distance interaction could leave only scattered traces, making it appear more sudden and structured than it actually was. Yet even with these limitations, some patterns remain difficult to dismiss. The repeated appearance of similar symbolic systems across unconnected regions suggests more than coincidence. Certain geometric motifs and organizational principles appear in contexts that predate known contact between those cultures. Whether these reflect shared cognitive tendencies or remnants of an earlier diffusion system remains an open question. Oral traditions again provide indirect support for complexity beyond the visible record. Many ancient cultures describe periods in which knowledge was widely shared across vast distances, sometimes attributed to ancestral figures, civilizing heroes, or early world teachers. These accounts are not consistent enough to form a unified historical narrative, but they do suggest that later societies perceived themselves as inheritors of something older and more fragmented than their own records could fully explain. In the absence of direct textual confirmation, archaeology becomes a study of relationships rather than isolated facts. Trade goods, settlement patterns, and technological similarities begin to function as indicators of connectivity. The question shifts from whether ancient societies were connected to how extensively and under what form that connectivity operated. And as these connections accumulate across time and space, they begin to form a faint outline of something larger than any single region. not necessarily a centralized empire in the traditional sense, but perhaps a diffuse system of influence, one that shaped early development, transmitted key innovations, and then receded, leaving only fragments embedded in later civilizations. It is within this expanding web of evidence that the idea of an ancient superpower becomes more than a speculative hypothesis. It becomes a possible interpretation of scattered signals, waiting for clearer definition as more sites are uncovered and more patterns are recognized. And with that possibility now taking shape, attention turns toward the moment when such a system might have reached its peak influence, and what forces could have driven it toward decline or disappearance. Along a stretch of land once cut by shifting rivers and seasonal floodplains, something unusual begins to appear in the archaeological record. It is not a single city or settlement, but a widening field of influence sites that share architectural logic, administrative structure, and material culture in ways that suggest coordination rather than coincidence. Yet there is no central capital that anchors them in the traditional sense of empire. Instead, the pattern resembles a distributed system, a network whose center is missing or perhaps never existed in a form that later civilizations would recognize. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. In most early civilizations, power consolidates visibly. Capitals emerge, rulers are named, monumental inscriptions declare authority. Even when records are fragmentary, the shape of political organization is usually discernible. But in this case, what survives does not behave like a typical empire. There are no clear imperial inscriptions tying regions together, no consistent royal lineage that spans multiple zones, and no single cultural marker that dominates all others. Instead, what appears is a shared framework subtle, consistent, and widely distributed. One of the most striking features is architectural alignment. Across distant settlements, building techniques show unexpected similarities in foundation preparation, load distribution, and spatial organization. Structures are oriented in ways that suggest standardized planning principles rather than purely local adaptation. In some cases, even modest settlements reflect design decisions that would normally be associated with more advanced administrative oversight. This does not confirm centralized control, but it does imply the circulation of knowledge at a level more structured than simple imitation. Material culture reinforces this impression. Tools and manufactured goods in different regions sometimes follow consistent proportions and functional designs, even when raw materials and environmental conditions vary. This suggests that knowledge was not only shared, but standardized in some form, whether through direct instruction, itinerant specialists, or shared cultural conventions. The result is a surprising level of coherence across geographically separated communities. Yet what makes this coherence difficult to interpret is its uneven intensity. Some regions display strong alignment with this broader pattern, while neighbouring areas remain culturally distinct. This patchiness challenges the idea of a fully integrated empire and instead suggests a more flexible system of influence, where participation may have varied depending on local conditions, alliances, or access to trade networks. Environmental geography may offer part of the explanation. River systems, mountain passes, and coastal routes naturally concentrate human movement. Over time, these corridors can function as channels for the rapid spread of ideas, technologies, and practices. In such a system, cultural coherence can emerge without formal political unity. However, even this model struggles to fully explain the depth of standardization seen in certain early contexts, particularly in administrative practices. In several early urban centers associated with this pattern, record-keeping systems appear suddenly and with remarkable consistency. Methods of accounting, inventory management, and resource allocation show structural similarities that go beyond basic necessity. These systems imply not just shared needs, but shared conceptual frameworks for organizing society. The emergence of such frameworks across distant regions raises the question of whether they developed independently, or were influenced by a now invisible transmission network. Some researchers propose the idea of specialist classes merchants, scribes, engineers who travelled between settlements, carrying not only goods but also technical knowledge. This would allow for the diffusion of standardized practices without requiring a unified political structure. In this model, the superpower is not an empire in the traditional sense, but a highly interconnected intellectual and economic sphere. Yet even this explanation leaves gaps. Certain technical innovations appear in multiple regions with timing that is difficult to reconcile with slow transmission. In particular, early advancements in irrigation planning, urban layout, and standardized measurement systems seem to emerge almost simultaneously in widely separated locations. While simultaneity in archaeological terms can sometimes span centuries, the clustering remains notable enough to invite further scrutiny. There are also signs of abrupt discontinuities within individual regions. Some settlements show evidence of sudden restructuring older layouts, replaced by more standardized systems without a clear transitional phase. This could indicate administrative reform, cultural influence from external sources, or internal reorganization triggered by broader regional changes. The difficulty lies in distinguishing between these possibilities using incomplete evidence. At the same time, oral traditions from later periods occasionally reference a time of shared order or common instruction, where knowledge of building, agriculture, and governance was said to be more uniformly distributed across distant lands. These traditions are not consistent enough to be taken as direct historical records, but they do reflect an awareness, however distorted, of a past in which cultural boundaries may have been more permeable than in later eras. It is important to emphasize that none of this requires the existence of a single ruling civilization controlling vast territories. The patterns observed in the archaeological record can be explained through multiple overlapping mechanisms, trade networks, environmental pressures, independent innovation, and cultural diffusion. The challenge is not that any one explanation is impossible, but that no single explanation fully accounts for all observed consistencies. This is where the concept of a hidden superpower becomes more nuanced. Rather than a centralized empire, it may represent a phase of human development characterized by unusually dense connectivity, a period in which ideas, techniques, and organizational principles moved rapidly across regions, creating the appearance of coherence without formal political unification. Such a system would leave traces that look structured but remain difficult to attribute to a single source of authority. Over time, however, this connectivity appears to weaken. Regional differences become more pronounced. Local cultures begin to diverge in clearer ways. Standardization gives way to localized adaptation. Whether this shift was gradual or triggered by specific disruptions remains unclear, but the archaeological record suggests a transition from high connectivity to more fragmented development. Some scholars link this shift to environmental changes that altered migration routes and resource availability. Others suggest that early networks may have been vulnerable to collapse once population densities or trade dependencies changed. In either case, the result is a gradual fading of the coherence that once linked distant regions. What remains after this transition is a world that appears more familiar to modern interpretations of ancient history, distinct civilizations, identifiable cultural boundaries, and clearer political structures. But beneath that clarity lies a deeper layer of unresolved complexity, where traces of earlier connectivity still persist in unexpected ways. And as these traces continue to surface, attention increasingly turns toward the possibility that what disappeared was not simply a civilization, but a phase of global interaction whose scale and structure have not yet been fully reconstructed. In a narrow corridor of ancient settlement layers, where soil shifts from river silt to compacted clay and then into older, darker strata, archaeologists find something that does not belong to any single cultural sequence. It is not a dramatic artifact like a royal inscription or a monumental relief. Instead, it is the quiet repetition of precision tools, weights, and design standards that appear across regions with a consistency that feels less like coincidence and more like inheritance. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. In early human societies, precision is not expected to emerge evenly. Measurement systems, for example, typically develop locally, tied to the human body, environmental constraints, or practical trade needs. One region may define weight based on grains, another on water volume, another on agricultural yield, yet in several early contexts, standardized systems appear with unusual alignment across distant settlements, not identical in every detail, but structured in ways that suggest shared conceptual origins. This is where the idea of an unseen superpower begins to shift in meaning. Instead of a political empire exerting direct control, what begins to emerge is the possibility of a shared technical framework, something that shaped how different societies understood space, quantity, and construction. These frameworks are subtle, embedded in everyday life rather than declared in monuments or royal decrees. One of the most striking examples comes from urban planning. In multiple early cities, street layouts follow surprisingly consistent geometric principles, not perfect replication, but a shared tendency toward grid-like organization, modular spacing, and proportional relationships between public and private space. These features are often associated with administrative planning, yet they appear in regions without clear evidence of direct administrative coordination. In parallel, early engineering practices show similar patterns. Drainage systems are designed with attention to gradient control. Building foundations reflect awareness of load distribution principles that would typically require accumulated engineering knowledge. Storage facilities are constructed with standardized capacities that suggest familiarity with broader economic planning systems. Taken individually, each feature can be explained as local innovation. Taken together, they form a pattern that is harder to reduce to coincidence alone. Material analysis adds another layer. Clay tablets, carved symbols, and early proto-writing systems in different regions sometimes share structural similarities in how information is organized, even when the scripts themselves are unrelated. This suggests that while languages diverged, underlying cognitive approaches to record-keeping may have followed shared templates. In other words, the way information was structured may have been influenced by common conceptual models. Even if the symbols themselves were locally developed, this raises a critical question that scholars still debate. If these systems were not imposed by a centralized authority, how did they become so widely aligned? One explanation is independent convergence driven by practical necessity. As societies grow more complex, similar organizational challenges produce similar solutions. Another explanation is diffusion through networks of specialist merchants, engineers, and scribes who carried knowledge between regions. Both models are plausible, and both are supported by partial evidence. However, there is also a deeper possibility that neither fully captures the scale of early connectivity. Some researchers propose that early human societies may have experienced periods of unusually dense interaction, where knowledge circulated more freely than in later historical eras. In such a system, ideas could spread rapidly along trade routes, seasonal migrations, and shared cultural corridors, producing the appearance of standardization without formal control. Yet even this model struggles to explain certain abrupt introductions of complex systems. In a few regions, standardized practices appear without clear local precursors. There is little evidence of gradual experimentation leading up to their adoption. Instead, they emerge as if introduced in a relatively complete form. Not perfect, not unchanging, but already structured in ways that suggest prior refinement elsewhere. Environmental factors may again offer partial insight. During periods of climatic stability, human populations expand, networks intensify, and communication between regions becomes more frequent. These conditions can accelerate the spread of ideas dramatically. But environmental change alone does not fully explain why certain systems appear in multiple regions with such structural similarity at early stages of development. Another intriguing aspect is the relationship between standardization and social organization. In several early settlements, the emergence of measurement systems coincides with changes in governance structures. Administrative roles become more formalized, resource distribution becomes more regulated, labor organization becomes more structured. This suggests that standardization was not only a technical development, but also a social one, shaping how communities organize themselves internally. At the same time, there are signs that not all regions adopted these systems uniformly. Some settlements maintain local variation in measurement and construction practices, even when located near areas of strong standardization. This uneven adoption suggests that influence was not absolute, but negotiated, accepted in some places, resisted or adapted in others. The result is a patchwork landscape of early civilization, where shared frameworks exist alongside local divergence. This complexity makes it difficult to define a single origin point or controlling center. Instead, what emerges is a distributed system of influence where knowledge flows in multiple directions and is reshaped by local conditions at every stage. It is within this distributed system that the idea of an ancient superpower takes on its most ambiguous form, not a singular empire, not a unified state, but perhaps a cultural and technological phase in which human societies were more deeply interconnected than later historical records suggest. A phase that left behind standardized traces, even as its organizational structure faded from memory. And as these traces accumulate, attention shifts toward a critical moment in this narrative, the point at which connection begins to strain, and the first signs of fragmentation appear across regions that were once loosely aligned in shared systems of knowledge. In the upper layers of several ancient settlements, something changes in the pattern of remains, where earlier strata show alignment, shared systems, and gradual refinement of techniques. These later layers begin to fracture. The coherence that once suggested broad connectivity starts to thin, replaced by regional divergence, interrupted sequences, and sudden shifts in material culture that do not always follow predictable paths. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Technological development in early societies is often described as cumulative. Once a useful method is discovered, it spreads, improves, and stabilizes. But in these transitional layers, that assumption becomes less reliable. In some regions, advanced techniques appear to stall or even regress temporarily, replaced by simpler forms of production. In others, innovation continues but in more isolated directions, with fewer signs of shared standards or external influence. One of the clearest indicators of this shift is in construction practices. Earlier periods show a surprising level of structural consistency across distant settlements, particularly in foundational engineering and urban organization. Later, the consistency weakens, building styles become more locally distinct. Standardized proportions give way to regional preferences. Even materials that were once widely traded become less uniformly distributed, suggesting disruptions in exchange networks. This is not a uniform collapse. It is uneven, staggered, and geographically inconsistent. Some regions maintain continuity longer than others. Certain river valleys continue to support complex urban systems, while nearby areas show signs of abandonment or reorganization. This patchiness suggests that whatever once connected these regions did not fail all at once, but gradually unraveled under different local pressures. Climate reconstructions provide part of the explanation. The early Holocene, which supported many early complex societies, was not static. It contained periods of relative stability interrupted by abrupt environmental fluctuations. Shifts in rainfall patterns, river courses, and regional temperatures would have placed significant stress on agricultural systems and trade routes. In some areas, prolonged drought or flooding could have forced migration, restructuring settlement patterns and breaking established networks of exchange. Yet environmental stress alone does not fully account for the degree of cultural fragmentation observed. In some cases, technological knowledge appears to persist locally even after broader systems of standardization weaken. Communities retain memory of advanced techniques but apply them in altered or simplified forms. This suggests that knowledge was not entirely lost, but its transmission pathways became less reliable. One possible explanation is the fragility of early information systems. Before widespread writing, knowledge depended heavily on oral transmission, apprenticeship, and symbolic memory systems. These methods are powerful within stable communities but vulnerable to disruption. Migration, population loss, or social fragmentation can break the chain of transmission quickly, leading to partial retention of complex systems without their full structure. In this context, the earlier appearance of widespread standardization becomes even more significant. If knowledge had once been transmitted across broad regions through stable networks, whether through trade, specialist groups, or shared cultural institutions, then the breakdown of those networks would naturally produce the fragmented patterns seen in later layers. What looks like sudden decline may in fact be the visible edge of a longer process of disconnection. Some archaeological sites show evidence of rapid restructuring during this period. Urban layouts are modified, sometimes dramatically, as communities adapt to changing conditions. Administrative buildings are repurposed, storage systems are reduced in scale, defensive structures become more prominent in some areas, suggesting increased local instability or competition between neighbouring groups. At the same time, there is evidence of cultural simplification in certain contexts. Decorative motifs become less standardised. Manufacturing techniques lose some of their earlier precision. Symbolic systems fragment into regional variants. This does not necessarily indicate a loss of capability, but rather a shift in priorities under changing social and environmental pressures. What is particularly striking is that this fragmentation does not erase the underlying knowledge entirely. Instead, it reshapes it. In some regions, simplified versions of earlier systems persist for centuries. In others, they are replaced by entirely new frameworks that appear to develop independently. This suggests that the knowledge base of early societies was resilient, but its connectivity was not. It is here that interpretations begin to diverge more sharply among researchers. One perspective views this period as a natural cycle of expansion and contraction, driven primarily by environmental variability and demographic shifts. In this view, the earlier coherence between regions was always temporary, a product of favourable conditions that eventually dissipated. Another perspective considers the possibility that early connectivity may have been more structured than previously assumed, and that its breakdown reflects the collapse of a broader system of interaction. This does not require a single controlling authority, but it does suggest that early human societies may have been part of a more integrated world than the archaeological record alone can easily reconstruct. However, caution remains essential. Fragmentation in the archaeological record can create the illusion of lost unity, even when none existed. Independent societies often develop similar responses to shared challenges, and environmental disruption can exaggerate the appearance of systemic change. The challenge lies in distinguishing between true disconnection and the natural variability of incomplete evidence. Still, certain patterns remain difficult to ignore. In a few regions, abrupt cultural transitions coincide with the disappearance of long-distance exchange markers. Imported materials become rare, standardized systems fade, local styles dominate more fully. It is as if the threads that once connected distant regions have been cut, leaving behind isolated strands of development. As these threads weaken, the idea of a once-connected ancient world becomes more difficult to define clearly, but also more compelling as a conceptual framework, not as a single empire collapsing, but as a network dissolving into its constituent parts, leaving behind echoes that are unevenly preserved in the archaeological record. And as the system continues to fragment, attention turns toward the moments where disappearance becomes more than just decline, toward the possibility that something decisive, whether environmental, social, or catastrophic, may have permanently altered the visibility of this ancient structure. In several excavation zones where settlement layers once showed steady continuity, there is a sudden break that does not behave like ordinary abandonment. It is not the slow thinning of population, nor the gradual relocation of communities. Instead, it appears as a discontinuity, a sharp reduction in material complexity, followed by a reorganization of cultural patterns that does not fully explain what came before it. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. This kind of archaeological break is not unknown. Civilizations can decline due to drought, conflict, disease, or resource depletion. But in many of these cases, the transition leaves behind a traceable chain of adaptation. Even when cities are abandoned, nearby settlements often preserve continuity of culture and technology. What is unusual in some early regions is the degree to which certain systems seem to vanish from visibility before reappearing in altered forms elsewhere, as if the transmission line itself was interrupted rather than simply weakened. One of the most notable features of this transitional period is the disappearance of long-distance exchange indicators. Materials that once travelled across vast regions become suddenly scarce or absent. Obsidian distributions tighten into local clusters. Exotic goods that previously appeared in administrative or ceremonial contexts no longer follow the same wide-ranging patterns. This suggests a collapse or severe restriction of the networks that once facilitated broader interaction. At the same time, internal regional differences become more pronounced, cultural styles diverge more sharply, tool-making traditions become localized, even measurement systems, which previously showed signs of standardization, begin to vary more significantly between neighboring communities. The coherence that once hinted at shared frameworks weakens, replaced by fragmentation that appears uneven and regionally specific. Some researchers interpret this as the breakdown of an interconnected system of exchange and knowledge transfer. In this view, what once functioned as a loosely integrated sphere of interaction spanning trade, communication, and shared technical practices gradually disintegrated under environmental and social pressures. The result is not a single collapse, but a cascading separation of previously linked regions. Environmental stress remains a strong candidate for triggering such a shift. Paleoclimatic data from multiple regions show periods of instability that could have disrupted agricultural output and forced migration. River systems that once supported dense populations changed course or became less reliable. In coastal areas, sea levels fluctuated in ways that may have altered trade routes and settlement viability. These changes would have placed significant strain on any system dependent on wide-ranging connectivity. Yet environmental explanation alone does not fully resolve the pattern of discontinuity. In some regions, cultural simplification appears abrupt rather than gradual. Complex administrative systems are replaced by simpler local structures without a clear transitional phase. In others, evidence suggests that knowledge of earlier systems persists but is no longer applied at the same scale or consistency. This partial retention complicates the idea of a complete breakdown. Another factor to consider is the vulnerability of early institutional knowledge. Without durable writing systems or centralized archives, much of early administrative and technical knowledge would have depended on trained specialists. If these groups were displaced, reduced in number, or socially restructured, the continuity of complex systems could have been severely affected. Knowledge could survive in fragments, but lose its coherence across generations. There are also signs that some regions experienced rapid social reorganization during this period. Settlement patterns shift toward defensible positions in certain areas, suggesting increased localized tension or insecurity. In other regions, populations consolidate into fewer but larger centers, possibly as a response to changing resource distribution. These adaptations indicate resilience, but also significant stress within existing systems. What remains particularly difficult to explain is the unevenness of this transformation. Some areas show clear signs of disruption, while others maintain continuity with relatively minor changes. This patchwork effect makes it difficult to identify a single cause or synchronized event. Instead, what emerges is a mosaic of regional responses to a broader set of pressures, both environmental and social. It is within this complexity that the idea of a hidden superpower becomes more ambiguous. If such a system of connectivity once existed, its decline does not appear as a single collapse, but as a gradual unraveling of multiple overlapping networks. Trade, knowledge transfer, and cultural alignment may have dissolved at different rates, producing a layered disappearance rather than an abrupt end. In some cases, later civilizations appear to reinterpret or simplify remnants of earlier systems. Complex administrative practices are reduced to more localized forms. Standardized measurements are replaced by regional variants. Even symbolic systems become more context-specific, losing some of their earlier cross-regional coherence. This suggests not only loss, but adaptation to a new reality in which broader connectivity is no longer reliable. Despite this fragmentation, echoes of earlier coherence persist. Certain technological principles reappear across different regions in later periods, sometimes independently, sometimes in modified forms. This raises the possibility that foundational knowledge was not entirely lost, but stored in dispersed cultural memory, resurfacing when conditions allowed. The archaeological record, however, does not preserve the mechanism of this transmission. What survives is the result, not the process. And so scholars are left with competing interpretations: gradual decline, environmental disruption, social fragmentation, or the dissolution of a once-connected system that has left only partial traces of its former structure. As this transitional phase comes into focus, attention shifts toward the most dramatic possibility within this narrative framework, the moment when continuity itself may have been interrupted so decisively that the system ceased to be visible as a unified whole, marking not just decline, but disappearance. In the deepest layers of several ancient urban sites, there is a point where the record changes its character entirely. It is not simply a reduction in complexity or a shift in cultural style. It is a narrowing of visibility itself. Earlier strata show diversity, exchange, and structured development. Then, within what is often a relatively short archaeological span, the complexity fades into something more localized, more fragmented, and far less connected across regions. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, one of the most important signals of this transition is the changing nature of record keeping. In earlier phases, even when writing systems are still developing, there is a clear effort towards structured documentation inventory lists, administrative records, symbolic accounting systems. But in later layers, this documentation becomes less consistent. Some regions retain writing, while others revert to simpler symbolic marks or lose written continuity altogether. The uneven survival of record-keeping systems is one of the key indicators that something broader than local change is occurring. In some archaeological contexts, it appears that written traditions do not evolve smoothly from earlier forms, but instead restart in altered directions. New scripts emerge that are not direct continuations of older systems, even when geographically close. This suggests either significant disruption in transmission, or the replacement of administrative elites who carried specialized knowledge. Scholars still debate which explanation better fits the evidence, and in many cases, both factors may have played a role. Another notable feature of this period is the reduction of interregional standardization. Earlier signs of shared measurement systems, architectural principles, and material conventions begin to fade. What once appeared as a loosely connected cultural sphere becomes a patchwork of local systems, each adapting independently. This does not imply isolation in a complete sense, but it does suggest that the intensity and reliability of long-distance coordination have diminished significantly. In some river valleys, settlement patterns show abrupt contraction. Large administrative centers shrink or are abandoned, while smaller, more dispersed communities become dominant. This shift can often be linked to environmental pressures, such as changes in rainfall or river stability. But the archaeological record also suggests that social reorganization played an equally important role. Communities appear to reconfigure themselves in response to changing conditions, but not always in ways that preserve earlier complexity. One of the more subtle but important changes during this phase is the simplification of material production. Objects that once displayed fine standardization and craftsmanship become more variable in quality and design. This is not necessarily evidence of decline in skill, but rather a shift in production systems. Large-scale coordination may have broken down, leaving smaller, more localized workshops to maintain traditions without the same level of oversight or shared standards. At the same time, there are traces of continuity embedded within this fragmentation. Certain technical practices persist across regions, even as broader systems dissolve. Agricultural techniques, for example, often remain stable, suggesting that foundational knowledge of survival and subsistence was resilient even when higher-level administrative systems weakened. This distinction between practical continuity and institutional fragmentation is crucial in understanding the nature of this transition. Some researchers interpret these changes as evidence of a systemic collapse affecting a previously interconnected world. In this view, what once functioned as a broad network of exchange, communication, and shared standards begins to fracture under cumulative stress. The result is not a single catastrophic event, but a progressive loss of connectivity that eventually reaches a tipping point where coordination becomes locally bounded. Others argue for a more gradual reinterpretation of the evidence. They suggest that early connectivity may have been overstated due to selective preservation of artifacts in certain regions. According to this perspective, what appears as a unified system may actually represent overlapping but independent developments that only seem connected in hindsight. Fragmentation, then, is not collapse, but the natural state of a loosely parallel set of civilizations. Yet even within this more cautious interpretation, certain anomalies persist. In a few cases, the timing of cultural shifts across distant regions appears unexpectedly aligned, not identical, but close enough to suggest that multiple societies were responding to similar pressures or influences within comparable timeframes. Whether these influences were environmental, social, or part of a now invisible exchange network remains uncertain. Another layer of complexity comes from genetic and demographic data. Human populations in many of these regions often show continuity across the transition periods, meaning that people did not disappear or get replaced en masse. Instead, it is the systems they used, administrative and technological and cultural, that changed. This distinction is important because it suggests transformation rather than extinction, even when the archaeological record appears sharply discontinuous. In some areas, there is also evidence of relocalization. Communities that once participated in broader exchange networks become more self-contained. Trade shrinks to regional scales. Cultural markers become more distinct between neighbouring groups. This shift toward localization may reflect both necessity and adaptation, as larger systems became less reliable or more difficult to maintain. The combined effect of these changes is a historical landscape that looks increasingly fragmented over time. What once hinted at broad coordination becomes a series of isolated developments, each adapting to local conditions and constraints. Yet beneath this fragmentation, faint echoes of earlier coherence remain embedded in architecture, measurement, and symbolic systems. It is this duality continuity at the human level, fragmentation at the systemic level, that makes the period so difficult to interpret. It is neither a clean collapse nor a smooth evolution, but something more complex, a reorganization of how human societies relate to one another across space and time. And as this reorganization deepens, the focus inevitably shifts toward the possibility that something more decisive may have occurred at a critical moment in the past, an event or series of events that transformed a once-connected system into something permanently altered, leaving only scattered traces behind. In a handful of archaeological sequences where cultural layers are especially well preserved, there is a moment that stands out not as a slow transition, but as a break in continuity so sharp it feels almost architectural in its precision. Below one horizon, there is complexity, exchange, and structured systems that hint at wide-ranging interaction. Above it, those same systems appear reduced, reorganized, or entirely absent in their earlier form. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. This is where interpretations begin to diverge most dramatically. To some researchers, this discontinuity represents the signature of collapse an event or sequence of events severe enough to disrupt long-distance networks, administrative systems, and shared cultural frameworks. To others, it reflects a more gradual process of decentralization that only appears sudden due to uneven preservation and regional variation. One of the most compelling lines of evidence associated with this transition is the disruption of large-scale exchange systems. In earlier layers, there is clear evidence of materials moving across vast distances in structured and repeated patterns. After the transition, those patterns become more localized. Exotic goods still exist, but they are less systematically distributed. Their presence becomes sporadic rather than networked, suggesting that the underlying infrastructure of exchange has weakened or fragmented. In some regions, this change is accompanied by shifts in settlement hierarchy. Large administrative centers that once coordinated regional activity appear to decline in influence or are abandoned altogether. Smaller settlements become more prominent, often showing increased self-sufficiency. This redistribution of settlement importance suggests a restructuring of social organization, potentially driven by external pressures or internal adaptation. Environmental data provides one possible context for this transformation. Periods of climatic instability are well documented in several regions during the late stages of early urban development. Changes in precipitation patterns, river flow variability, and temperature fluctuations could have placed stress on agricultural production. In systems dependent on surplus distribution and coordinated exchange, even moderate environmental stress can produce cascading effects across multiple regions. However, environmental explanation alone does not fully account for the structural nature of the change. In some cases, the disappearance of standardization and long-distance coordination appears too coordinated in its timing to be explained solely by local ecological variation. This has led some scholars to propose that social and political factors may have amplified or accelerated the process. One possibility is that early interconnected systems were highly dependent on specialized roles and institutional continuity. If those roles were disrupted through migration, conflict, or demographic shifts, the systems they supported could degrade rapidly. Administrative knowledge, once centralized in specific groups, may not have been easily transferable to broader populations. In such a scenario, collapse would not require total societal failure, only the breakdown of key structural nodes. Another factor to consider is the fragility of early communication systems. Without durable, widely standardized writing, the transmission of complex administrative and technical knowledge would have relied heavily on human intermediaries. This makes such systems vulnerable to interruption. Even a relatively brief disruption in connectivity could lead to long-term fragmentation of knowledge and practice. What complicates this interpretation is that some regions show partial continuity through the transition. Certain technological traditions persist with little interruption, suggesting that not all systems were equally affected. Agricultural practices, for example, often remain stable, while administrative and exchange systems undergo more dramatic change. This uneven impact suggests selective disruption rather than total collapse. In a few cases, there is evidence that communities adapted by scaling down complexity rather than abandoning it entirely. Large coordinated systems are replaced with smaller, localized versions that retain some of the original principles but operate within a narrower scope. This form of adaptation indicates resilience, but also confirms that broader coordination was no longer functioning in the same way. There are also subtle indications of cultural reinterpretation during this period. Symbolic systems become more regionally distinct, and shared motifs that once appeared across wide areas begin to diverge. This could reflect both reduced interaction and intentional redefinition of identity in response to changing social realities. As connectivity weakens, local identity often becomes more pronounced. Despite these changes, the archaeological record does not show a clean break. Instead, it reveals overlapping phases of continuity and disruption. Some systems fade gradually, while others appear to end more abruptly. This unevenness makes it difficult to assign a single cause or timeline to the transformation. What emerges instead is a layered process unfolding at different speeds across different regions. Within this complexity, the idea of a hidden superpower shifts again in meaning. It no longer appears as a singular entity that rose and fell, but as a system of interdependence that gradually lost coherence. Its power, if it can be called that, may have been distributed across networks of exchange, knowledge, and shared practice rather than centralized authority. As these networks weakened, what followed was not immediate disappearance, but reorganization. Societies adapted to reduce connectivity, developing more localized systems of governance and production. In doing so, they preserved fragments of earlier complexity while reshaping them to fit new conditions. Yet even as adaptation occurred, the sense of an earlier integrated world does not fully disappear from the record. It lingers in inconsistencies, in timing overlaps, and in the uneven survival of systems that once seemed more broadly aligned. These remnants continue to challenge simple explanations. And as the focus turns deeper into this transitional moment, attention shifts toward the possibility that what is being observed is not merely decline or adaptation, but the aftermath of a more decisive rupture, one that may have permanently altered the structure of early human connectivity. In certain sediment cores taken from ancient floodplains and dried river basins, there is a layer that behaves differently from everything above and below it. It is not marked by a single catastrophic signature, like a volcanic ash bed or an impact horizon. Instead, it is defined by subtle but widespread disruption changes in sediment density, shifts in material distribution, and a sudden reduction in long-distance cultural markers that once connected distant regions. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. What makes this horizon significant is not its dramatic intensity, but its consistency across different environments. In some regions, it corresponds with abandonment of major urban centres. In others, it aligns with the reorganisation of smaller settlements into more isolated clusters. The pattern suggests not a single localised disaster, but a broader restructuring of how human societies were distributed across landscapes. Archaeologists often describe such transitions as threshold events, moments when accumulated pressures push systems into new configurations. In this case, multiple factors appear to converge. Climatic instability likely played a role, with evidence of fluctuating rainfall patterns and shifting river systems affecting agricultural productivity. Even small changes in water availability can have large consequences in early agrarian societies, dependent on predictable seasonal cycles. But environmental stress alone does not fully explain the scale of transformation observed. In several regions, The disappearance of standardized systems occurs in ways that suggest more than gradual adaptation. Measurement systems lose their uniformity, administrative practices become localized, exchange networks shrink or reorient. The speed and breadth of these changes imply that social structures may have been destabilized in ways that extended beyond environmental triggers. One possibility is that early interconnected systems reached a level of complexity that made them inherently fragile. As populations grew and dependencies increased, the failure of one component, whether a trade hub, administrative center, or key ecological zone, could ripple outward through the entire network. In such a system, resilience depends not only on strength, but on redundancy and adaptability. If those qualities were insufficient, fragmentation could occur rapidly once stress thresholds were crossed. Another contributing factor may have been demographic redistribution. Archaeological and genetic evidence in some regions suggests population movements during this period, though not always in the form of dramatic migrations. Instead, there may have been gradual dispersal from dense centres into more localised settlements. This would naturally reduce the intensity of long-distance exchange and lead to the regionalisation of cultural practices. In parallel, there are signs that knowledge transmission systems were changing. Early complex societies often relied on specialised roles for maintaining administrative and technical knowledge. If these roles were disrupted, either through social upheaval or structural reorganisation, the continuity of complex systems could weaken quickly. Even without population collapse, the loss of institutional continuity can produce significant cultural fragmentation. What is particularly notable is that this transition does not appear uniform. Some regions show clear signs of disruption, while others maintain partial continuity of earlier systems. This unevenness suggests that the forces driving change were not applied equally across all areas. Instead, they may have interacted with local conditions in different ways, producing a mosaic of outcomes rather than a single synchronized collapse. In certain areas, evidence suggests that communities responded by simplifying rather than abandoning complexity. Administrative systems become less centralized, production becomes more localized, exchange continues but at reduced scale. These adaptations indicate that societies were not simply breaking down, but actively restructuring themselves to survive under new constraints. Yet even in these adapted systems, traces of earlier connectivity remain visible. Certain architectural principles persist. Some measurement concepts survive in modified form. Symbolic motifs continue to appear across regions, though often altered in meaning or function. These remnants suggest that while large-scale coordination weakened, the underlying knowledge base was not entirely lost. This distinction between loss and transformation is crucial. What appears in the archaeological record as disappearance may in fact represent reconfiguration. Systems that once operated at broad regional scales may have been compressed into local contexts, preserving fragments of their original structure while losing their wider coherence. However, there are still unresolved anomalies. In a few regions, abrupt changes occur without clear preceding instability. These cases are rare but significant because they do not easily fit into models of gradual adaptation or environmental pressure. They raise the possibility that multiple mechanisms were operating simultaneously, including localized disruptions that cannot be easily generalized across the entire system. It is within this complexity that the idea of a hidden superpower becomes increasingly difficult to define in traditional terms. If such a system once existed, it may not have been a centralized empire, but rather a highly interconnected web of societies whose cohesion depended on stable environmental and social conditions. When those conditions changed, the web did not collapse in a single moment, but unraveled unevenly across space and time. The result is a historical landscape that appears fragmented not because nothing existed, but because what existed no longer functioned as a unified system. The evidence does not point to erasure in the literal sense, but to transformation so extensive that the original structure becomes difficult to reconstruct from its remaining parts. As the record continues to thin across this transitional horizon, attention turns toward what comes after fragmentation, not the disappearance itself, but the ways in which later societies interpret, reconstruct, and sometimes obscure the memory of what came before. Because even after systems break apart, their traces do not simply vanish, they are reinterpreted, repurposed, and occasionally rewritten. And it is within that process of reinterpretation that the next layer of the mystery begins to emerge. In the centuries that follow the major transitional horizon, the archaeological record does not simply resume its earlier trajectory. Instead, it reorganizes itself into something more familiar to later history, distinct cultural zones, clearly defined political structures, and more localized systems of administration. The sense of broad, loosely connected coherence that once characterized earlier phases is no longer visible in the same form. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. What is most striking in this post-transition landscape is not the absence of civilization, but the absence of alignment. Earlier layers hinted at shared frameworks across distant regions, common principles in measurement, architecture, and exchange. In later layers, those shared frameworks become harder to trace. Cultures develop more independently, and while contact still exists, it appears less structurally integrated. One of the clearest signs of this shift is the localization of technological development. Innovations continue to emerge, but they do so within more confined cultural boundaries. Techniques that once appeared to spread rapidly across wide regions now show slower, more uneven diffusion. Some technologies are reinvented independently in different places, while others remain confined to specific regions for extended periods, before reappearing elsewhere in altered forms. This suggests that the mechanisms of knowledge transfer have changed. Where earlier periods may have supported broader circulation of ideas, whether through trade networks, specialist groups, or shared institutional frameworks, later periods appear more segmented. Communication still occurs, but it is less efficient, less standardized, and more dependent on local conditions. In several regions, administrative systems also show this shift toward fragmentation. Early forms of record-keeping that once displayed structural similarities across wide areas now diverge more sharply. Local accounting practices develop distinct conventions. Symbolic systems evolve in different directions. Even when writing systems persist, they do not always retain the same organizational logic seen in earlier phases. At the same time, there is no evidence of a universal collapse. Many societies remain stable, productive, and capable of long-term development. Cities continue to grow in certain regions. Agricultural systems remain robust in others. What changes is not the existence of civilization itself, but the coherence between civilizations. This distinction is important. The archaeological record does not support the idea of a single global failure. Instead, it suggests a reconfiguration of connectivity. Networks that may once have linked regions into a loosely integrated system appear to have weakened or reorganized into smaller, more localized clusters. In some cases, this reconfiguration may have been adaptive. As environmental conditions changed, localized systems may have proven more resilient than large, interconnected ones. Reduced dependency on long-distance exchange could have made societies more stable in the face of regional disruptions. Fragmentation, in this sense, may not represent loss, but recalibration. Yet there are also signs that something was preserved unevenly across this transition. Certain architectural principles, symbolic motifs, and technological ideas continue to appear in later periods, sometimes in ways that suggest inherited knowledge rather than independent invention. These survivals are not uniform, but they are persistent enough to indicate that some strands of earlier connectivity endured. The difficulty lies in determining how these strands were transmitted. Without continuous written records, much of the mechanism remains invisible. Oral tradition, apprenticeship systems, and localized instruction could all preserve fragments of earlier knowledge, but each method is vulnerable to distortion over time. What survives may be accurate in parts, but incomplete in structure. Some researchers have suggested that later civilizations may have unconsciously reconstructed elements of earlier systems without fully understanding their origins. In this view, similarities across cultures are not evidence of direct continuity, but of repeated rediscovery of effective solutions under similar constraints. This would explain both the presence of shared features and their uneven distribution. Others argue that the persistence of certain standardized elements points to deeper continuity than the record clearly shows. Even if formal networks dissolved, cultural memory may have retained structural knowledge that influenced later development. This memory would not necessarily preserve explicit history, but rather functional patterns embedded in practice. What complicates both interpretations is the presence of discontinuities within continuity. In some regions, long-established practices disappear abruptly and are replaced by entirely new systems. In others, gradual evolution is more clearly visible. This uneven pattern suggests that multiple processes were operating simultaneously, including both preservation and reinvention. As time progresses, these regional differences become more pronounced. Civilizations develop distinct identities, shaped by geography, environment, and local historical trajectories. The earlier sense of a shared framework becomes increasingly difficult to detect, even if its remnants persist beneath the surface of later developments. Yet the absence of visible connectivity does not necessarily mean total isolation. Trade continues, ideas still move, and cultural exchange persists. What changes is the scale and structure of that exchange. Instead of broad, multi-regional alignment, interactions become more selective and localized. This shift has significant implications for how the ancient world is reconstructed. If earlier phases did contain broader systems of connection, their dissolution would naturally leave behind a fragmented record. Later civilizations would inherit only partial views of what came before, shaped by their own local contexts and limitations. In this way, history becomes layered not only in time, but in perspective. Each civilization reconstructs the past from the fragments it inherits, often without access to the full scope of earlier connectivity. Over generations, this can lead to increasingly localized interpretations of what was once a more interconnected system. And it is within this accumulation of partial perspectives that the idea of a forgotten or erased superpower begins to take on its most subtle form not as a clearly identifiable empire, but as a missing layer inferred only through its uneven echoes in later history. As attention moves forward, the focus turns toward the possibility that some of these echoes may not be accidental at all, but physical remnants that continue to resist full integration into accepted historical frameworks. In modern excavation reports from multiple continents, there are occasional references that carry a particular kind of unease among researchers, not because they are dramatic or clearly anomalous in isolation, but because they resist being absorbed into the standard narrative without leaving a remainder of uncertainty behind. These are artifacts and structural traces that appear fully real, fully measurable, and yet difficult to reconcile with the historical sequences assigned to them. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Some of these objects are architectural in nature. Stonework that demonstrates precision cutting techniques in periods where such methods are not expected to be fully developed. Foundation alignments that suggest planning principles more consistent with later engineering traditions. In other cases, it is the scale of construction that raises questions, especially when found in contexts that do not show the gradual build-up of labour organisation typically required for such projects. These anomalies are not universally accepted as evidence of a hidden civilization. In many cases, they are reinterpreted through more conventional explanations, later intrusion into earlier layers, misclassification of strata, or regional variation in technological development. Archaeology, by its nature, is cautious in assigning meaning to isolated findings, and rightly so. Single anomalies rarely overturn established frameworks. Yet what makes this collection of evidence more intriguing is its repetition across different regions. Similar patterns of precision appear in distant sites with no clear cultural connection in the established record. Not identical artefacts, but comparable technical outcomes, tightly fitted masonry, unexpected geometric consistency, and construction techniques that imply accumulated knowledge rather than isolated experimentation. In parallel, there are material objects that suggest long-distance interaction in ways that remain difficult to fully map. Certain alloys, decorative styles, and manufacturing techniques appear in contexts that do not align neatly with known trade networks of their time. While each case can be individually explained through indirect exchange or later contamination, the broader distribution pattern continues to raise questions about how knowledge and materials moved in the ancient world. One particularly interesting category involves objects that seem to sit at the boundary between functional technology and symbolic expression, items that appear to encode measurement systems, calendrical knowledge, or geometric principles in ways that suggest shared conceptual frameworks. These are not widespread enough to define a universal system, but their presence across multiple regions hints at underlying intellectual continuity that is not fully visible in the surviving record. Some researchers interpret these findings as evidence of convergent development, different societies independently arriving at similar solutions due to shared human cognitive tendencies and environmental constraints. This remains a strong and widely supported explanation. Human problem-solving often leads to similar outcomes when faced with similar challenges, especially in areas such as construction, agriculture, and administration. However, others point out that convergence does not always account for the specific details observed in certain cases. It is not just that similar solutions exist, but that similar structural principles appear in contexts where independent invention would require a degree of parallel development that seems statistically unusual, even if not impossible. This does not prove connection, but it complicates the simplicity of purely independent emergence. There is also the issue of preservation bias. The archaeological record is inherently incomplete. Organic materials decay, sites are destroyed or buried, and entire layers of history can be lost without trace. What survives is a selective sample, and that sample can distort perception of how continuous or discontinuous ancient systems actually were. It is entirely possible that intermediate stages once existed, but have not been preserved in a way that allows full reconstruction. Still, even acknowledging this limitation, the pattern of scattered but recurring anomalies remains difficult to fully dismiss. It suggests that ancient technological and cultural development may not have been evenly distributed, but shaped by uneven pulses of innovation, transmission, and loss. In some regions, later civilizations appear to inherit fragments of earlier systems without preserving their full context. Measurement principles survive while their origins are forgotten. Architectural techniques are retained while their broader framework disappears. Symbolic motifs persist while their meanings shift or fragment over time. This kind of partial inheritance creates a layered historical landscape where continuity exists, but in incomplete form. What emerges from this is not a clear picture of a single erased civilization, but something more diffuse, a pattern of uneven survival, where certain elements of earlier complexity persist across time, while others vanish entirely. The result is a historical record that contains both continuity and discontinuity at the same time, depending on which aspects are being examined. This duality is central to the mystery. If an ancient superpower or highly connected system once existed, its influence may not have survived as a coherent narrative. Instead, it may exist only as scattered fragments embedded within later cultures, each preserving a different aspect of a once broader structure. And as these fragments are studied more closely, attention begins to shift toward the question of interpretation itself. Not only what the evidence shows, but how different frameworks of understanding shape what is considered visible, explainable, or significant within the archaeological record. In that shift of perspective, the next layer of the story begins to emerge, one that deals not only with ancient systems, but with how modern scholarship reconstructs, debates, and sometimes inadvertently reshapes the memory of the past itself. In the modern study of ancient history, the same set of artifacts can often lead to sharply different interpretations depending on the framework applied to them. A fragment of pottery might be seen as evidence of local innovation in one analysis, and as part of a broader diffusion pattern in another. A structural similarity between distant sites might be dismissed as coincidence or elevated as potential proof of shared systems. The evidence itself rarely changes, but the lens through which it is viewed does. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. This is especially relevant when examining the scattered traces associated with what some researchers loosely describe as an earlier, highly interconnected phase of human development. There is no consensus on what, if anything, unified these patterns. Some scholars argue that the similarities across regions are fully explainable through independent invention and environmental convergence. Others suggest that the degree of alignment in certain systems is difficult to account for without assuming some form of broader interaction. The debate is not about whether ancient societies were capable of complexity. That is well established. The question is whether complexity emerged entirely in isolated pockets, or whether there were periods in which knowledge circulated more widely and efficiently than later fragmentation suggests. The difference between these two interpretations is subtle, but it has profound implications for how ancient history is reconstructed. One of the key challenges in this discussion is the uneven nature of archaeological preservation. Entire regions remain under-excavated. Coastal settlements have been submerged. River systems have shifted, burying earlier habitation layers under meters of sediment. What is visible today represents only a fraction of what once existed, filtered through both natural destruction and modern discovery limitations. This means that absence of evidence cannot always be treated as evidence of absence. At the same time, caution remains essential. The temptation to connect scattered data points into a unified narrative can lead to overinterpretation. Archaeology has repeatedly shown that human societies can produce similar solutions independently when faced with comparable constraints. Agriculture, metallurgy, urbanization, and writing all emerge multiple times in different parts of the world without requiring a single source of origin. Yet there are still patterns that resist easy categorization. Certain structural similarities in early administrative systems, for example, appear in regions that do not show clear evidence of direct contact in other domains. Measurement systems, spatial organization, and resource accounting sometimes follow comparable principles even when cultural contexts differ significantly. These overlaps are not uniform enough to prove direct transmission, but they are persistent enough to remain of interest. Another important factor is the role of later interpretation. Ancient records that survive into modern times are often incomplete, copied, translated, and reinterpreted across generations. Each transmission introduces potential distortion, whether intentional or accidental. What is preserved is not a neutral record of the past, but a layered construction shaped by the needs and understandings of successive societies. In some cases, historical narratives were actively reshaped by later civilizations seeking to legitimize their own origins. Older traditions may have been simplified, merged, or reframed to fit newer ideological structures. This process does not necessarily involve deliberate erasure of entire civilizations, but it can result in the gradual loss of complexity in how earlier periods are remembered. Within this context, the idea of a hidden superpower becomes less about a single lost empire and more about the cumulative effect of selective preservation and reinterpretation. What survives in the record may reflect not only what once existed, but also what later societies chose or were able to preserve and transmit. Modern analytical techniques, including remote sensing, isotopic analysis, and improved dating methods, continue to refine this picture. In some cases, they confirm earlier assumptions. In others, they introduce new anomalies that require reinterpretation. The result is not a stable narrative, but an evolving one, shaped by both new discoveries and shifting methodological approaches. There is also increasing awareness that connectivity in the ancient world may not have been uniform. Instead of a single integrated system or a set of completely isolated cultures, the reality may have involved fluctuating networks of interaction. These networks could expand and contract over time, depending on environmental conditions, political stability, and technological capability. Such a model helps explain why evidence of similarity appears in some periods and regions but not others. It also accounts for why traces of broader connection can be detected without forming a continuous, easily traceable chain. Connectivity may have existed in pulses rather than permanence, leaving behind fragments that do not always align neatly in the archaeological record. Even so, the question remains open as to whether these pulses were entirely emergent or partially structured by earlier, now invisible systems of organization. The evidence does not allow a definitive answer. It only allows for competing interpretations, each supported by different aspects of the same fragmented record. As this debate continues, attention increasingly turns toward the implications of what is missing as much as what is present. The gaps in the record are no longer seen as empty spaces alone, but as active components of interpretation. They shape the boundaries of what can be confidently reconstructed and what remains speculative. And within those boundaries, the possibility persists that the ancient world may have once contained forms of connectivity and organization that were later dissolved, restructured, or reinterpreted to the point where only indirect traces remain visible today. The next step in the narrative moves beyond interpretation itself, toward the physical and environmental evidence that continues to preserve echoes of those lost connections in ways that are not dependent on written records or later reconstruction. Across ancient landscapes that once supported dense human activity, there are physical traces that do not rely on written records or later interpretation. These are embedded in the environment itself, changes in soil composition, shifts in settlement density, and patterns in land use that persist long after the original cultural systems have faded. They are not narratives preserved in language, but imprints left in the earth. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. One of the most significant environmental signals comes from abrupt changes in land occupation patterns. In several regions, areas that were once intensively settled show a gradual reduction in activity, followed by long periods of relative abandonment. Nearby regions, however, may show continued occupation with only moderate disruption. This uneven distribution suggests that changes in human systems were not synchronized globally, but occurred in waves shaped by local conditions and broader regional pressures. Sediment analysis in river basins adds another layer of evidence. In certain layers corresponding to transitional periods, there are shifts in erosion and deposition patterns consistent with changes in land use intensity. Reduced agricultural activity in some zones leads to reforestation or natural regeneration, while in others, intensified cultivation leaves behind distinct chemical signatures in the soil. These patterns help reconstruct how human presence expanded, contracted, and reorganized over time. In coastal regions, similar environmental traces appear in the form of shifting harbour usage and abandoned infrastructure. Some ancient ports show evidence of long-term decline, while others emerge suddenly as new centres of activity. This redistribution suggests that trade and communication routes were not static, but constantly adjusting to changing environmental, political, and possibly social conditions. What is particularly intriguing is that these environmental shifts sometimes align with the broader patterns observed in material culture. Periods of reduced long-distance exchange often coincide with changes in land use and settlement structure. While correlation does not prove causation, the repeated alignment of these trends across different regions suggests that they may be linked through underlying systemic changes affecting both human organisation and environmental interaction. Climate reconstructions provide a partial framework for understanding these transitions. Variations in temperature and precipitation over long time scales would have influenced agricultural productivity and settlement viability. In some cases, even modest shifts in climate could have had cascading effects on trade networks and population distribution. However, climate alone does not fully explain the complexity or unevenness of the observed changes. There are also indications that human activity itself may have played a role in reshaping local environments in ways that influenced later settlement patterns. Deforestation, irrigation, and agricultural expansion can alter soil stability and water systems, sometimes creating feedback loops that either support or undermine long-term sustainability. These processes vary significantly by region, making it difficult to generalize their impact across the entire ancient world. In some areas, environmental data suggests relatively smooth transitions between phases of occupation. In others, there are sharper breaks, where human activity declines rapidly and is followed by long periods of ecological recovery. These differences highlight the importance of regional context in interpreting large-scale historical patterns. When combined with archaeological evidence, these environmental signals reinforce the idea that ancient human systems were deeply interconnected with their surroundings. Changes in one domain often had ripple effects across others. Settlement patterns influenced land use, which in turn affected resource availability, which then shaped social and economic structures. Yet despite this complexity, the broader pattern remains consistent: a transition from more interconnected systems of human activity to more localized and regionally distinct forms of organization. Whether this transition was gradual, punctuated, or a combination of both remains a subject of ongoing debate. Some researchers interpret these environmental and archaeological signals as evidence of a long-term reconfiguration rather than a single collapse. In this view, what is observed is the gradual dissolution of broader networks of interaction, replaced by more resilient but localized systems better adapted to changing conditions. This interpretation emphasizes adaptation over disappearance. Others suggest that the scale and coordination of earlier connectivity may have been greater than what is easily visible in the surviving record, and that its breakdown represents a significant structural transformation in how human societies related to each other across space. In this interpretation, environmental change may have acted as a catalyst, but not the sole driver. What remains clear in both perspectives is that the physical landscape retains traces of these transitions in ways that are independent of later historical interpretation. Soil layers, settlement distributions, and ecological shifts preserve a form of memory that does not rely on written tradition, offering a parallel record of human activity that complements and sometimes challenges textual sources. It is in this intersection between environmental evidence and archaeological reconstruction that the story begins to converge toward its final implications. The question is no longer only what existed, but how such large-scale patterns of interaction could have changed so thoroughly without leaving a continuous narrative in the historical record. And as this convergence becomes clearer, attention shifts toward the final layer of the mystery, the ways in which modern understanding integrates these fragments into a broader interpretation of human history, and what that interpretation suggests about the legacy of a once-connected ancient world. At the edge of what can be confidently reconstructed, the ancient world begins to look less like a sequence of isolated civilizations and more like a long series of overlapping systems that rise, interact, and gradually lose coherence over time. The fragments do not point toward a single, neatly defined origin or collapse. Instead, they suggest something more complex, a shifting landscape of human connectivity that changes its form as much as its content. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Modern interpretations of early human history increasingly emphasize this complexity. Rather than searching for a single missing empire or unified superpower, many researchers now focus on patterns of interaction, how ideas, technologies, and practices move between groups, and how those movements changed over time. In this framework, the missing structure is not necessarily a lost civilization, but a lost pattern of connectivity that no longer exists in the same form. Archaeological evidence supports this shift in perspective. The same data that once seemed to suggest sudden appearances or disappearances can often be reinterpreted as the result of uneven preservation, regional variation, and long-term environmental change. Yet even with this more cautious approach, certain patterns remain difficult to reduce entirely to local explanations. The recurrence of shared principles across distant regions continues to invite questions about the scale and intensity of ancient interaction. What becomes increasingly clear is that human societies have never developed in complete isolation. Even in the earliest periods, there is evidence of contact, exchange, and mutual influence. The real question is not whether connection existed, but how extensive and structured it was at different points in time. That structure may have expanded and contracted repeatedly, leaving behind alternating layers of coherence and fragmentation. In this sense, the idea of a hidden ancient superpower transforms into something less literal and more conceptual. It becomes a way of describing periods when connectivity was high enough to produce broad similarities across regions. Even without centralized control, these periods may have been followed by phases of fragmentation, where local adaptation became dominant and broader alignment faded into the background. The difficulty in reconstructing this process lies in the nature of the surviving evidence. Archaeology preserves moments, not systems in motion. It captures snapshots of human activity, but not always the full network of relationships that produced them. As a result, large-scale patterns must be inferred from incomplete sequences, always with some degree of uncertainty. At the same time, it is important not to overextend the gaps in the record. The absence of clear evidence for a unified ancient superpower does not necessarily imply deliberate erasure or hidden continuity. More often, it reflects the limits of preservation, the unevenness of discovery, and the complexity of independent development across diverse environments. Still, the persistence of certain anomalies ensures that the discussion remains open. Shared architectural principles, recurring symbolic systems, and early standardizations of measurement continue to appear in ways that invite comparison, even if they do not demand a single explanation. These patterns may reflect shared human cognition, environmental convergence, or earlier phases of more intensive interaction that are no longer directly visible. What emerges from all of this is a more layered understanding of the past. Instead of a simple narrative of rise and fall, human history appears as a dynamic interplay between connection and separation, standardization and divergence, integration and localization. These forces do not replace one another cleanly, they overlap, interact, and leave traces that are sometimes difficult to disentangle. In this layered view, the ancient world was neither fully unified nor fully fragmented. It existed in a state of shifting balance, where networks of exchange and influence expanded under certain conditions and contracted under others. The remnants of those shifts are what the archaeological record preserves today, even if imperfectly. The idea of an erased or hidden superpower, then, can be understood less as a literal missing empire, and more as the imprint of these shifting phases of connectivity. What appears missing may actually be transformed, dispersed across time and region, embedded within later systems that no longer resemble their earlier form. As the narrative reaches its end, what remains is not a final answer, but a framework for interpretation, a recognition that the past is not a single, stable structure waiting to be fully uncovered, but a complex accumulation of processes, some visible, some partial, and some permanently out of reach. And in that recognition lies the final image this story leaves behind, not a lost empire waiting to be rediscovered in full, but a vast, fading web of human connection, once wide enough to shape entire regions, now visible only in fragments scattered across soil, stone, and memory, quietly reminding us that history is often larger than the stories we are able to fully reconstruct.